At some point, you look up and realize that most of the people who used to be central to your life are now somewhere on the periphery. No argument, no falling out, no single moment you can point to. Just a gradual widening of distance that happened so slowly you barely noticed it until it was already done. For most people, this produces a vague guilt, a sense that something was neglected. That better effort would have kept those friendships alive. But the psychology of drifting away from friends as you grow older is more nuanced than that. And in many cases, it reflects something that's actually working rather than something that's broken. Let's start with a foundational question that most people never ask. Why did those friendships exist in the first place? The honest answer for most of us is proximity. Psychologists who study relationship formation have documented something called the propinquity effect, the consistent finding that physical and circumstantial closeness is the single strongest predictor of who becomes friends with whom. Not shared values, not deep compatibility, just being in the same place at the same time, repeatedly. You became friends with the people in your class because you were in the same class, with your neighbors because they lived next door, with your colleagues because you spent 40 hours a week in the same building. The friendship felt real, and in many ways it was, but the foundation underneath it was largely circumstantial. It was built on the fact of being in the same situation at the same time, not necessarily on a genuine meeting of who each person actually was. This matters enormously for understanding what happens later. Because when the circumstances change, when you move, change jobs, enter a different phase of life, the foundation of those friendships changes too. The shared context that made the relationship easy and natural disappears. And without it, the connection requires something it didn't need before: active choice. Genuine effort to bridge a gap that didn't used to exist. Some friendships survive that transition. Many don't. And the ones that don't aren't necessarily casualties of neglect. They may simply be revealing, for the first time, that the relationship was held together by circumstance rather than by something more durable. There is also something worth acknowledging about the specific texture of those reconnection attempts that sometimes happen: the coffee catch-up after years of silence, the text exchange that briefly rekindles something, the reunion that everyone agrees was great and then leads to nothing further. These moments are real. The warmth is genuine. But they also tend to confirm, quietly, what the drift already suggested: that the connection exists in the past tense more than the present one. That what the two people share is a history, not a currently inhabited common ground. And recognizing that clearly, without resentment, without forcing something that isn't there, is itself a form of maturity that doesn't get acknowledged enough. The second piece goes deeper, and it's the one that's most personal. People drift away from old friends when they've changed significantly, and the friendship was built around an earlier version of themselves. This is not a comfortable thing to recognize, but it's a real psychological phenomenon. Identity is not static. The person you are at 50 is not the same person you were at 25 or 30. Your values have shifted. Your sense of what matters has been refined by decades of experience. Your interests, your way of engaging with the world, the things you find meaningful and the things you've moved past, all of it has evolved in ways that are significant even when they're gradual. The friends who knew you at 25 knew that version of you. They have a picture of who you are that was formed in a specific context, at a specific time, and that may not have been updated in years. When you spend time with them, there's often an implicit pressure to inhabit that old version, to be the person they remember rather than the person you've become. Or alternatively, to do the work of explaining how you've changed, which is exhausting in its own way. Neither option feels quite right. And the result, for many people, is that the connection starts to feel like a costume they have to put on, something that doesn't fit anymore, but that seems rude to discard. Psychologists who study identity evolution and relationship quality have found that people report lower satisfaction in friendships when there's a significant gap between who they feel themselves to be and how they're perceived by the other person. The friendship becomes a context where you feel less like yourself rather than more. And over time, that dynamic quietly erodes the motivation to maintain it. Drifting, in this light, isn't abandonment. It's an honest response to a growing mismatch between who you are and who the relationship knows you to be. The third piece is the one that explains why many people in this situation don't simply try harder. Their standard for what makes a friendship worthwhile has changed. In younger years, friendship is often measured in frequency and shared history. How often you see each other, how many experiences you've accumulated together, how deep the mutual knowledge runs, even if that knowledge is of a person you no longer quite are. As people move into their 40s, 50s, and beyond, that metric quietly shifts. What starts to matter more is something harder to quantify, but easier to feel: genuine resonance in the present. The sense that the person across from you actually knows who you are now, not who you were, and finds that person interesting and worth their time. That the conversation reflects your actual life and actual thinking, not just a shared archive of memories from 20 years ago. Psychologists who study meaning in relationships across the lifespan have found that older adults consistently prioritize emotional depth and present-tense connection over social breadth. A smaller number of relationships that feel genuinely current and mutually resonant produces higher well-being than a larger number of relationships maintained primarily through shared history. This shift in standard makes the work of maintaining certain old friendships feel not just difficult, but slightly dishonest. When the main thing connecting two people is a past they've both moved away from, and the present-tense versions of each person have relatively little to offer each other, continuing the friendship can start to feel like a performance, like showing up to maintain an appearance of connection rather than to actually connect. For people who have come to value authenticity in their relationships above all else, that performance stops being worth the effort. And it's worth saying that this isn't bitterness about the old friendships or the people in them. Most of the people on the other side of these drifted relationships are perfectly decent people who simply inhabit a different chapter. The drift isn't a verdict on them. It's just an honest acknowledgement that chapters end, and that staying in one that's already over requires a kind of pretending that grows harder to sustain over time. That performance stops being worth the effort, not because they've become cold or self-absorbed, because they've become honest about what connection actually means to them. So let's be clear about who these people are. They are not failing socially. They are not becoming lonely by default. They are not people who gave up on friendship. They are people who built most of their early friendships on circumstantial foundations that have since shifted, who have grown into someone their old friendships don't fully recognize, and who have arrived at a standard for connection that most of those old friendships can't meet. It is also worth noting what these people tend to find on the other side of the drift. Not isolation, in most cases, but a smaller, more carefully chosen set of connections, people met later in life, when the choosing was more deliberate and the compatibility more real. Friendships built on who each person actually is rather than on who they happen to be standing next to at a particular moment. These connections tend to require less maintenance because they're not fighting against a growing mismatch. They just fit. In a culture that treats a long list of maintained friendships as a social achievement, these people are living by a quieter and more honest measure. Not how many people do I still call friends from before, but how many people actually know who I am right now. Drifting away from old friends isn't losing something. Sometimes it's making room for something more honest. If that resonated, leave a comment. I'd like to hear your thoughts. I'll see you in the next video.